Welcome back into our class, BI 300. This is Biblical Economics, and we continue our conversation with regard to this issue and how it impacts the life of the church, and it impacts all of our entire society. Let's look at this. We made these statements in the past. We said that how people view money is an effective barometer of their spirituality. Let's be honest. Most people have elevated money to the level of God. So money is what they worship. Money is what they seek. I don't care where you are in the world. I don't care if you're in Latin America. I don't care if you're in Africa. I don't care if you're in Australia. I don't care that if you're in Indonesia. Okay? I don't care if you're in Asia. I don't care if you're in Europe. I don't care if you're in the United States of America. Wherever it is in the world, overwhelmingly, the majority of people have made it the following decision: that their definition of success in life is the acquisition of money. So money rules their lives. So that's the reason why I will tell you that how people view money is an effective barometer of their spirituality. It doesn't matter if you have a lot or you have very little. That's the truth. Now, let's begin to look at this. Money is neutral. Money is not moral. It is neither good nor bad. You need to understand that. Also, in addition to that, you must comprehend that what people do with their money reflects their internal morality. What you do with your money is a reflection of your own personal internal morality. Now, we're going to pick up this conversation where we left off the last time and pick up the next point. That is, people may also lack money because of impulsiveness or hastiness. Because of impulsiveness or hastiness. Just for the moment, let's set aside all of the social, cultural arguments, all of the economic and political arguments aside, because that's not the conversation we're having here. We're having a biblical conversation. Doesn't matter. Let me tell you something. The rich are not only impulsive and the rich are not only hasty. So are the poor. The only difference between the rich and the poor is that one has and the other one has not. But they have the same outlook in many areas of their lives. So I want to draw your attention to the book of Proverbs. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 21, verse 5 through 7. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 21, verses 5 through 7. Look at this with me. Look at what it says here, because I want to draw your attention to it. He says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage. The acquisition of treasures by a lying tongue is a fleeting vapor, the pursuit of death. The violence of the wicked will drag them away because they refuse to act with justice." Now look at these three verses, because the writer of this Proverbs puts them together for a specific reason. Now the verses address the evils, the absolute evils of ill-gotten gain. Ill-gotten gain. You see this in this concept of impulsiveness or hastiness. Look what he says. Now, in these three verses, you're going to note three issues. Okay? Number one, hastily. Number two, deceitfully. And number three, violently. We're going to see those three issues. Look what he says here, because they show the three major defects in the way this gain is acquired. Number one, hastily. Look what he says in verse 5. He says, "The plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty." In verse 6, we see that it is deceitfully gained. He says, "The acquisition of treasures by a lying tongue," deceitfully, "is a fleeting vapor, the pursuit of death." And then number 7, look at verse 7, which is number 3, violently. He says in verse 7, "The violence of the wicked will drag them away because they refuse to act with justice." I want us to come to the issue from a biblical perspective. I don't care what your social, cultural, political, economic issue is, because all of that is fleeting. It's constantly moving. It's not stagnant. Okay? It's constantly fluctuating back and forth. But the one thing that is sure and permanent is God. and his word and his promises to us. And there is a cause and effect relationship that we have with the living God. We obey him, he provides. We disobey, he holds back. That's the issue that I want to drive. But the reality is that we tend to be more cultural than we are scriptural. And pastor, if you don't understand your people, you don't understand where they are, the truth of the matter is most times you're the problem, pastor. You are the issue. You are the issue because you fear teaching your people the truth. I was exchanging some emails this weekend with a couple of pastors, and they kept telling me that I did not understand that their cultural situation was very different from the cultural situation that I found myself in North America. And I wrote back to them and I said, that was absolute nonsense. We're not speaking about culture, we're speaking about scripture. We're speaking about a biblical truth, and the biblical truth transcends all cultures, all nations, all languages, all political situations. The God that we serve here, it's the same God you serve over there. God is not different. But you have chosen to be dominated by your cultural precepts rather than the biblical precepts. So I want you to see this with me today. Look at what he says in verse 5. In verse 5, he says this. He says, the plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage. The truth is, for most of us, we are not diligent. We're lazy. And he says at the end of verse 5, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty. Everybody who is hasty comes surely to poverty. Look at this with me. I want you to see this with me, because I want you to understand something, that poverty is not a virtue. It's not. I understand. Listen, I was raised in poverty. But as I have understood my situation in my family situation, as I understood it, let's be honest about it. I was raised in it, I understand it. But I was in poverty not because of where I was born. I was in poverty not because of the ethnic group that I belonged to. Okay? That's not the reason why. I was in poverty because my father was a drunk. Now, you can get into all the social cultural issues about that. But the truth is that his decisions made decisions about us, his family. And we had to suffer the consequences. And everywhere that I've been around the world, and I've been to a lot of countries around the world, when I look at poverty, poverty is something that's caused by us most times. We are the cause of it. Now, we blame everybody else for it. So let's look at this. He says at the end of verse 5, he says, look what he says very carefully. He says, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty. So here's the principle. People may also lack money because of their impulsiveness or hastiness. He says it may lead, he says, everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty. So the question is, what is poverty? So let's look at this very carefully. I'm going to flip this board over because I want to have this conversation with you. And the conversation, everything that we're doing in this class, everything that we're doing in this course, obviously is designed purposely to provoke you. I'm not apologizing for that. I need to provoke you and shake you out of your comfort zone and shake you out of the cocoon of lies that you have bought into, you've nurtured, okay, and you've enclosed yourself in. So what is poverty? Well, poverty, by definition, is the state of being extremely poor. Of being extremely poor. The truth is that most decisions about poverty has to do with the issue of decision making. People are born into poverty, true. You don't have to stay in poverty. And so the poverty issue is an issue that's resolvable. It's an issue that you can defeat. It's an issue that you can overcome. Why is it that most people never overcome the issue? It's because if you listen to them very carefully and you are honest about it, you realize all of the decisions that they have made that keeps them exactly where they are. And there's an advantage to staying where you are in the life of the church. Most poor churches love being poor because they can always depend on some missionary or missionary church to provide for them. And henceforth, they're not responsible for anything. They're just the recipients of everything. So let's look at this. What does poverty mean? Poverty means that it's the state of being extremely poor. I want you to understand something. Poverty is not a virtue. It is not a virtue. That's not something you should be proud of. Poverty, we cause the poverty in our own lives by the kinds of decisions that we make. Now, you may have been born into poverty, not a choice of yours, but you don't have to stay there. And I've seen this everywhere, all over the world. Now, I want to begin to look at this because let me compare the United States of America. Okay? That's where I happen to be located right now in this particular class in Los Angeles, California, in the western part of the United States. So for all of my international pastors all over the world that are tuning in right now, I want you to understand that. Now, this guideline exists for your country. Every country has some kind of a guideline how they define poverty. Now, we in the United States, this is how we define poverty culturally, economically, and politically here because we're just simply not ashamed. Now, when you look at these numbers, this is the middle class in most countries around the world. Now, poverty in the United States, okay, I want you to understand how this works, okay? So let's begin to look at this idea of poverty because it leads to poverty. He says, the plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage in verse 5, Proverbs chapter 21, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty. Now, poverty is the scarcity or the lack of a certain amount of material possessions or money. Did you see that? Poverty is the scarcity or what? Or the lack, okay, of a certain amount of material, okay, possessions or money in it. Now, I want you to see this with me because I want to define this with you, okay? And I want to just kind of put two concepts together to tie in what we've been talking about. So let's look at this. We said that economics, okay, is the study, okay, of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses. That's economics, okay? So I want you to see this with me because I really need you to hone in on the idea, the concept itself. Then I want to take you now to, let's define poverty, okay? So I want to try to put these two concepts together, okay? So poverty I have to learn how to write. Been on a computer for so long, I have forgotten my penmanship. Poverty is the scarce or the lack, okay, of a certain amount of material. Excuse me. Possessions or money. Now, I want to try to draw your attention to this. Because, Pastor, you're going, well, I don't need to know that. I don't need to understand that. Yes, you do. That's the reason why your church suffers and you suffer, and the ministry that God has placed into your hands suffers because of our own ignorance of the subject matter. I'm trying to encourage you. I want to elevate you to understand what your situation is in your... Listen, I've worked this problem out in the Philippines. I've worked it out in Indonesia. I've worked this thing out in China. I've worked it out in Pakistan. I've worked it out all over Latin America, all over Africa. I've worked this issue out in Europe. I've seen this work. We oversee 714 churches in 54 countries and 118 languages in the poorest countries around the world. Excuse me. And yet, all three churches do the same thing. Number one, they've all purchased their own land with their own money. I haven't sent them $1. Number two, they've all built their own church buildings physically and equipped and furnished those church buildings with their own money. I don't send them $1. Number three, all three of them have a full-time paid pastor on their staff with their own money. I don't send them $1. Now, do you think I might have something to add to this? You think I might have something to say about this subject? I'm not trying to be prideful. I'm not trying to be super spiritual here. But I do want to provoke you to wake up out of your lethargy, to wake up out of the ideas that we have bought into that are defeating us. So poverty and economics. Notice the similarity here, what it is. Number one, economics is the study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses. And number two, poverty is the source, is the scarce of the lack of a certain amount of material possessions or money. They tie together. So now, poverty is a multifaceted concept which may include social, may include economic, may include political elements. Of course. Absolute poverty, extreme poverty, or destitution refers to the complete lack of the means necessary to meet basic personal needs such as food, clothing, and shelter. So that's the definition. Food, clothing, and shelter. That's what we define as basic need, all right? So let's put that up, okay? So let's look at basic need. This is how basic need is defined all over the world, okay? So it's going to be three things primarily, okay? It's going to be it's going to be basic need, which is personal for each person, okay? It's going to be food, clothing, okay? And shelter. These are the three items that are measured all over the world for basic need. Now, the poverty line, which is also sometimes called the poverty threshold, is the smallest amount of money a person or a family needs to live on to buy what is needed, not wanted. People who are below this line are classified as poor. This line is used to decide who can get extra help for things like food and shelter and so forth and so forth. Now, what I want you to see is I'm going to use the U.S. federal guidelines 2018, okay, for what we define, okay, as the federal poverty guidelines. In other words, for one person in the United States to live in 48 states, this excludes Alaska and it excludes Hawaii. It says that one single person, you need at least $140 per year just to meet your personal needs in the United States of America. Now, around the world, that's a lot of money in other places. So you have to define what it is for you in Asia. You have to define what it is for you in Latin America. You have to define what it is for you in Europe. You have to define what it is for you in Australia, what it is in Africa, and all these other places around the world. You have to define that for you. For two people, it's $16,460. For three people, it's $20,780. For four people, it's $25,100. For five people living in a household together, it's $29,420. For six people living in a house, it's $33,740. For seven people, it's $38,060 per year. And for eight people, it's $42,380. Now, for every other additional person in the family, so if you have a ninth child, example, a ninth person family, you have to add $4,200 more. So in the United States, this is how we define poverty, which basically makes you middle class, upper class in most countries around the world. when you do the currency exchange. But this is what we call poverty here. Now you know why most people are trying to get to this country from around the world. Now the question is, what is your definition of poverty in Asia? What is your definition of poverty in Latin America? What is your definition of poverty in Europe? What is your definition of poverty in Africa? What is your definition of poverty, okay, in North America? What is your definition of poverty in Australia? In other words, you see, I need you to begin to see the bigger picture here. So poverty, let me tell you something, is not a virtue. But poverty is an illusion because it's based on this idea that poverty is the source or the lack of a certain amount of material possessions or money. Now here's the question. Who defines the material possessions or money? Who's defining that? Who makes that definition? Now, I'll give you an example. We were in one of the villages along the Zambezi River in Africa. And the head tribesman was trying to convince me that his village was poor. This is what he was trying to convince me of, okay? And I'm listening to him, and I'm a very patient individual. You may not believe that, you may not think that, but you know, I got nowhere else to go. I'm in the middle of Africa. I'm in the middle of the bush. Where am I going to go? Not like I was going to go and watch TV. And I'm standing there, and I'm listening to him, and I'm very patient listening to him, and he's explaining to me all this. In the meantime, I noticed something. And I'm standing there, and they had a big fire going on, and all the people that came in from the different huts that they were living in, and they had to come in, and they were getting ready to do some kind of a celebration. And the one thing that I'm in the middle of the bush. Listen to this very, very carefully. I'm in the middle of the bush, and everybody has a cell phone. Now, I've got a team with me from my own home church there. Children have cell phones in the middle of the bush in Africa along the Zambezi River. And I'm not talking about play phones, toy phones. These phones actually work. So I asked the question. I noticed everybody had cell phones. You know, it's an incredible thing, that invention. It's impacted the entire world. Now remember the basic definition of personal need. The basic and personal definition for need is food, clothing, and shelter. Anything else takes away from this. Anything else. So I asked the question. I'm in the middle of the bush in Africa, and I asked the question, how much money does the average cell phone cost per month? How much money does the average cell phone cost per month? And they have to get these little, I forget what they call them, cards? SIM cards, is that what it is? And then they renew them? Is that what it's called? Okay, SIM cards, okay? And so I said, how much does it cost? And they said, well, this is, for us here, the average cost, listen to this very carefully, the average monthly cost for them was the equivalent of 35 US dollars. Do you understand what I just said to you? Now, if you're in the United States, you go, man, that's a great deal. But if you're sitting in the middle of the bush, the average cost is $35 for a cell phone. Everybody and their mother and the grandmother and the children have cell phones. We've got pictures of this. This is what is amazing. In fact, we asked them, please raise your cell phones. And it was shocking to see how many people had a cell phone. And I said, well, I want to get this straight. Everybody here pays $35 a month for these cell phones. He goes, yes. I said, so explain to me poverty. Go back with me. In Proverbs chapter 21, the plans of the diligent, in verse 5, lead surely to advantage, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty. They were trying to convince me that they did not have enough clothing for their winter. They did not have enough food for their winter. And I said, yeah, but you are spending, now your winter lasts 4 to 5 months. Am I correct? They go, well, yeah, basically. Okay, so let's take this. Let's take this. So you're telling me that you're spending $35 for the next 5 months. You're spending $35 for the next 5 months on a cell phone, correct? So we got 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, right? Right? Past 2, 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. So you spent $175 on a cell phone. So let me ask you this question. How much money do you need to buy enough grain to sustain you for the next 5 months during the winter season? And this is what he told me. He says, we need $80. So you just spent your food money right here on your cell phone. And I'm supposed to provide that? How much does it cost you for your shelter? They said, well, we build our own shelter. I said, I know. Well, how much does it cost you to get the bricks and the mud to build your huts? They said, well, we need $60. So that's $140. Am I right in my math? That's $140. But you just spent it on your cell phone. My point is that a lot of us, what we consider, we have mixed the idea, we've confused the idea of want and need. We do this all the time in the United States. We do this in the Western world all the time. And we're complaining we don't have enough. But I see the exact same problem in Asia. I see the exact same problem in Latin America. I see the exact same problem in Africa. I see it in Europe. I see it in Australia. It doesn't matter where you go. People make the same decisions. Poverty is not a virtue. You don't have to stay in poverty. You've made a decision that keeps you there because you make impulsive, hasty decisions. And this is the issue that's driven to us by the writer in the book of Proverbs. When he says in Proverbs chapter 21, verse 5, he says this very clearly. He says, the plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty. Then, and I want you to understand this issue. This is a real problem. So now, here's an example. I want you to see this very carefully with me. So, food, clothing, and shelter. This is a scarce resource with alternative uses. Follow me? Stay with me. Stay with me on this issue. You got $175. That's a scarce resource with alternative uses. Why? Because instead of going to food, clothing, and shelter, it went to cell phones, and it went to what? And instead of going to grain, right? You see this? Is this making sense to you? So here is the situation that you have. You have a scarce resource right here, but it has alternative uses. And so every time you make another decision, you have an alternative use that is going to impact the bottom line each and every single time. That's the reason why poverty is defined almost close to the study of economics. When we say that economics is the study of the use of scarce resources which have alternative uses, and poverty is the scarce or the lack of a certain amount of material possessions or money. So you're always operating with lack, but it doesn't mean you have to stay in lack, because there's a divine rule that can permeate. Okay, there's a divine rule that can set aside the human limitations. So divinity intervenes into humanity. We have a divine law which says seed time and harvest. It says, do not deceive yourself, for God cannot be mocked. Whatsoever a man sows, he shall and will reap.